the Hollywood Unapologetic podcast with Orlando Dilbert, Filmmaking Essentials.
Yeah, today we're getting into something really critical, I think, how disinformation actually spreads.
And especially how it impacts things like international relations. It's everywhere.
It really is. And look, in the world we live in now, being able to, spot this stuff, understand it, it's not just a nice to have skill anymore, is it?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
It's pretty vital if you want to make sense of complex global events, form your own opinions, and frankly, avoid being manipulated.
Exactly. We've pulled together quite a range of sources.
Yeah, we're looking at news reports, Associated Press, ProPublica, some academic research too, government analyses from places like Global Affairs Canada, CS.
Commentary from news shows, PBS NewsHour, The Daily Show, Big Think. Even insights from books on media and filmmaking. It's a real mix.
A broad perspective, definitely.
So our mission today for you listening is pretty straightforward. We want to help you get a much clearer picture of how disinformation actually operates.
And we'll use the U.S.-Ukraine relationship as a key example because it's so relevant right now.
Right. But the tactics, the methods we'll discuss, they apply much more broadly. You'll see these patterns elsewhere.
Okay, shall we jump in?
Let's do it. A really good place to start, I think, is this concept with a pretty dark history, but it's still incredibly relevant, the big lie.
Ah, the big lie. Yeah, you hear that term a lot. It's often linked back to Goebbels and Hitler.
Right.
Sources like the Jewish Virtual Library and Wikipedia cover that history.
Exactly. And the core ideas behind it are disturbingly simple but effective.
Like never admitting you're wrong.
That's a big one. Never admit fault. And always blame one single enemy for, everything that's going wrong.
And the repetition, just hammering it home again and again.
Crucially, yes. Repetition. The idea is that if you repeat something often enough, no matter how outrageous, people eventually start to accept it, or at least get used to hearing it. It's interesting how different sources touch on that power of repetition. There's Miriam Bowers-Abbott, a logic professor, who talks about embedding the idea in different ways, not just word-for-word repetition.
Right, making it seem like it's coming from multiple angles, even if it's the same core message. And Dr. Matt Blanchard at NYU makes a fascinating point about how even things like, T-shirts or hats can normalize a political idea.
Make it seem commonplace, even if it's extreme.
Exactly. It creates this background noise of acceptance.
Building on that, Wikipedia mentions this U.S. book from way back in 1947 about Hitler's death. It talked about utilitarian lies.
Utilitarian lies. How so?
Well, the argument was that Soviet leaders supposedly, kept the ghost of Hitler alive after the war.
Why would they do that?
For political justification, apparently. To, legitimize their own system, their military buildup. It was a lie serving a very specific political end.
That's a key point, the purpose behind the lie. And we definitely see that with how the big lie concept is used today.
Like the denial of the 2020 U.S. election results.
Precisely. I mean, numerous sources, NPR, the New York Times, Reuters, CNN, Washington Post, they've all documented this extensively as a modern example. It wasn't just a mistake. It had clear political aims.
Yeah, and the fallout continues. It's interesting, Bill Barr, speaking on Fox News, he actually argued that the other so-called big lie, the one about Russian collusion, he argued that actually damaged Trump's ability to deal with Putin. So these things can have really complex, sometimes unintended, ripples.
That's true. And it's also worth noting, as the Washington Post pointed out, that there's been this kind of conservative effort to almost co-opt the term big lie itself.
Right, to turn it back on opponents.
Which just shows how the language around disinformation can become part of the battleground.
Okay, so let's shift focus specifically to Russia and Ukraine now. This seems like a prime case study.
It really is. Global Affairs Canada, for instance, has tracked how Russia has used disinformation pretty heavily to advance its goals there.
Going back quite a way, right? Not just the recent invasion.
Oh, definitely. Back to the annexation of Crimea in 2014, supporting the separatists in the Donbas region. It's been a consistent tool in their kit.
And it's important to remember, as some experts argue, that the war didn't just start in February 2022.
That's a crucial point. Andrei Zumland, for example, points to February 20th, 2014. That's the date supposedly on Russian orders for invasion prep, and it's even on their Crimea campaign medal.
Wow. So well before the world's attention was fully grabbed.
Or you could point to the occupation of the Crimean parliament on February 27th. Many researchers see that as the real start. Understanding that longer timeline helps contextualize Russia's use of disinformation. It wasn't sudden, it was sustained.
Right. So when the full-scale invasion did happen in 2022, what kind of specific disinformation narratives did we see?
Well, a flood of them. One really persistent one, highlighted in that article about the infamous Russian troll farm, is the claim that Ukraine is, quote, run by Nazis.
A very inflammatory and historically loaded accusation.
Extremely. We also saw things like that image of the grandmother with the red flag.
Oh, I remember seeing that. What was the story there?
Well, Wikipedia explains it was basically a propaganda push. The image was meant to suggest that ordinary Ukrainians actually wanted to reunite with Russia, evoking maybe Soviet nostalgia or something.
Trying to manufacture consent, essentially.
Pretty much. And then you had the fakes involving celebrities, which were quite elaborate.
Like what?
Things like a fake story about Leonardo DiCaprio donating a huge sum, but also manipulating messages from platforms like Cameo.
Where celebrities record personal messages.
Exactly. And editing images of celebrities to push anti-Zelensky narratives.
No.
Wikipedia documented quite a few of these. It shows the lengths they'll go to, using recognizable faces to try and sway opinion.
It's quite sophisticated in a way.
And ProPublica did some interesting analysis on the Internet Research Agency, the IRA, the troll farm, basically.
What did they find?
They saw a shift in messaging after the full-scale invasion. The focus moved towards unifying Russians behind Putin's war, justifying it by blaming NATO.
And downplaying their own losses, presumably.
Of course. Minimizing casualties. And importantly, these kinds of fakes weren't just staying within Russia. They were being spread on Western outlets, too, like the BBC, DW, Euronews, were targeted with similar fabricated reports.
So it bleeds out into the wider information space.
It absolutely does, and it's chilling when you think about Alexei Navalny's perspective.
Yeah.
He talked about the monstrosity of lies in Russian state media, how overwhelming it is, and sadly how convincing it can be when people don't have access to alternative information.
That control of the information environment is just so powerful.
It really is. Which brings us to the actual tactics. How they do this.
Right. CISA, the U.S. cybersecurity agency, they have some insights here, don't they?
They do. One key tactic they highlight is starting small. Disinformation actors often target smaller audiences first, maybe on alternative social media platforms.
Why there?
Often because there's less content moderation. It's easier to get stuff out there, see what sticks, maybe build a bit of momentum before trying to make it go viral on the bigger platforms like Facebook or Twitter.
Okay, so it's like a testing ground. And places like Telegram, which the conversation notes is huge in Ukraine, but also rife with Russian disinformation, that fits the bill.
Exactly. CISA even provided this image that shows it visually, targeting specific content, maybe through social media, aiming it at a particular person or group to get a desired reaction or outcome.
It can be quite personalized then.
It can be. And this links to the whole idea of troll farms, right? Which EBSPG talks about, these organized groups coordinating online campaigns to manipulate public opinion on a much larger scale.
And it's not just anonymous trolls, is it? Influencers get drawn into this too.
That's a huge factor now. The Cornell Chronicle pointed this out. You have some influencers, maybe like Tucker Carlson, who seem to openly support the Russian narrative. And others, perhaps like Lauren Southern, who might implicitly denigrate Ukraine, maybe making light of it, like joking about getting those rubles.
Whether they mean it seriously or not, it contributes to a certain narrative.
It does. And the digital constitutionalist makes a really interesting point about why influencers can be so effective.
What's that?
They're often seen as real people, not institutions. They build these seemingly close personal relationships with their followers. That trust makes them great for marketing products.
And potentially great for marketing narratives or disinformation, too.
Unfortunately, yes. That perceived authenticity is powerful.
So it's not just what is said, but who says it and that relationship they have. Okay, that makes sense. Let's dig into the psychology a bit more. Why are people susceptible to this stuff?
Yeah, OSF, the Open Science Framework, their research offers some really valuable clues here. A big factor seems to be our social identities.
Like our religion, ethnicity, political affiliation.
Exactly. Those group identities can make us significantly more likely to believe misinformation if it sort of aligns with our group's views or paints rival groups in a bad light.
We want to believe good things about our own group and bad things about others.
It seems to be a powerful bias. The research highlighted that people with a strong sense of in-group identification, or what they term collective narcissism.
Collective narcissism.
Yeah, like an excessive need for the in-group to be admired. Those individuals are more likely to believe flattering lies about their own group or damaging lies about outgroups.
Can you give an example?
Well, the OSF study found, for instance, that heterosexual individuals who strongly identified with their sexual identity were more likely to buy into false information directed against the LGBTQ+ community.
Wow. So our group belonging can actually cloud our judgment on truth.
It appears so. Our desire for positive group identity can make us less critical of information that reinforces it, even if that information is false.
And that has huge implications for trying to correct misinformation, doesn't it?
Massive. Wikipedia notes that just throwing facts at someone who believes deeply in a big lie often doesn't work. They might just double down.
So what does work?
Well, it seems we need broader strategies. Things like improving critical thinking skills generally, encouraging exposure to diverse viewpoints, and maybe even addressing the underlying emotional vulnerabilities or needs that the misinformation might be tapping into.
That sounds much more complex than simple fact-checking.
It is. And psychology today also brings up this idea of 5 stages of ideological commitment. The suggestion is that as someone gets deeper and deeper into an ideology, they might become more prone to dysfunctional behaviors, potentially including accepting and spreading false information that supports their worldview.
It really feels like disinformation hooks into some very basic human psychology, our need for belonging, for validation.
I think that's right. And this connects directly to the broader tactics used by authoritarian regimes.
How so?
Well, there's a podcast, Filmmaking, Authoritarianism, and Media, that lays out this kind of authoritarian playbook. Spreading disinformation isn't just random, it's often a core part of a strategy to consolidate power.
Okay, so what are some of these plays in the playbook?
One big one is just creating confusion. Flooding the zone with so much conflicting information, so many falsehoods, they call it the fire hose of falsehood, that people just kind of give up trying to find the truth.
Overwhelm them.
Exactly. Another is using information that's technically true, but presenting it in a really deceptive or out-of-context way.
Twisting facts.
And then there's the classic ad hominem attack, attacking the person making an argument instead of the argument itself.
We see that all the time. Distract and discredit the messenger.
Absolutely. The playbook also includes things like silencing critics, going after journalists, whistleblowers.
Making dissent risky.
Right. And scapegoating vulnerable communities. Creating an us versus them narrative by blaming a specific group for society's problems.
Dehumanizing them.
Yes. And finally, the podcast mentions stoking violence, or at least the threat of it. Think about the rise in threats against election workers in the U.S. that undermines democratic processes through intimidation.
And these tactics don't exist in isolation, do they? They work together.
That's a crucial point the podcast makes. They often reinforce each other. Disinformation might be used to justify cracking down on dissent, which then makes it easier to spread more disinformation without challenge. Scapegoating can fuel calls for violence. It's a cycle.
A dangerous cycle.
Very. And the podcast raises this vital question. Are these just isolated incidents we're seeing, or are they part of a pattern? If institutions, courts, media, political bodies don't push back effectively when these norms are broken,
then the behavior risks becoming normalized.
Exactly. And that's incredibly dangerous for any democratic system.
Okay, let's talk more directly about social media's role in amplifying all this. We've touched on it, but it feels central.
It's absolutely central today. The Daily Show gave that really stark example after the Las Vegas shooting.
What happened there?
Almost immediately, complete false accusations spread like wildfire on social media, wrongly identifying an innocent person as the shooter. It just showed the sheer speed and, frankly, irresponsibility with which narratives can explode online.
No checks, no balances in that initial surge.
Very few. And it's quite telling, as the Daily Show also pointed out, that even foreign actors, like Russia, clearly understood how vital social media was. They were running campaigns targeting specific states like Michigan and Wisconsin.
They saw it as a key battleground for influence.
Unquestionably. And the concern, obviously, is that a major goal is often simply to sow division, to turn groups against each other within a country like the U.S.
Using social media as a wedge.
And Hollywood Redefined adds another layer all the data social media platforms collect.
On what we like, what we click on.
Yeah. That data is gold, not just for advertisers, but for tailoring the content we see. The algorithms push stuff they think we'll engage with.
Which can create echo chambers, right? Where we mostly see things that confirm our existing beliefs.
Exactly. It can reinforce biases and make it harder for different perspectives or even factual corrections to break through. Even if it's unintentional on the platform's part sometimes, That's the effect.
So the very structure of social media can inadvertently help disinformation spread.
It certainly can facilitate it.
Okay, one last area to touch on briefly is the connection sometimes drawn between this kind of disinformation and the rhetoric historically associated with fascism.
Right. Jason Stanley, for example, in a Big Think video, talks about core elements of fascist rhetoric.
Such as?
Often a cult of personality around a leader, this promise of national restoration, blaming perceived enemies, minorities, immigrants, elites for past humiliation.
And often a call for a strong, sometimes violent response to reclaim greatness.
Yes, that kind of macho, action-oriented, often anti-democratic appeal.
And PBS NewsHour, among others, has explored how some people see parallels between that historical language and some contemporary political rhetoric.
Yes, that pattern of identifying scapegoats, invoking a lost golden age, and calling for aggressive action to restore it. It's a recurring theme that some analysts see echoes of today.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this all up. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. But I think the main thing is understanding that disinformation isn't simple. It's this multifaceted tool, right? It has deep historical roots.
Like the big lie concept.
Exactly. And it's being used very actively right now in major geopolitical conflicts like the U.S.-Ukraine situation we focus on.
And it relies on a whole range of tactics, from outright fakes to subtle manipulation, using influencers, starting small on niche platforms.
And it absolutely preys on our psychology, our group identities, our emotions, and social media just pours gasoline on the fire, amplifying everything.
So for you listening, the crucial takeaway really is that understanding these dynamics, the methods, the motivations, makes you a much savvier consumer of information.
It equips you better to resist manipulation, to think critically about what you're seeing and hearing, especially in today's really complex information landscape.
It really empowers you.
It does. And maybe a final thought to leave you with, something to chew on.
Go on.
Considering how all these tactics work together, how they can erode trust in institutions and facts in each other, what's our role in pushing back?
As individuals.
As individuals, yes. But also, what's the role of our institutions? Government, media, education. And what responsibility do the social media platforms themselves bear for the information and disinformation that flows across them?
That's a huge question. No easy answers there.
No easy answers at all. But it's definitely something worth thinking about as you navigate the information you encounter every single day. You can find more insights on navigating the entertainment industry and achieving success in Orlando Delbert's work, including his book, Pollyanna's Tear-Soaked Battlefields of Hollywood, a survival guide against the cynicism and the hypocritical, and of course, the Hollywood Unapologetic platform. And always remember, you are the key to your own success. You are the new Hollywood generation.
Be informed, be prepared, and most importantly, be great.
That's it. Be great. Good luck out there.
See you next time.